What's up, y'all? You've tuned in to Pop Politics with me, your host, Dr. Monique Alicia Gamble. I'm an assistant professor, a screenwriter, and a photographer, and this show is a fusion of two things that I love to talk about, pop culture and politics. So let's get to it. What's up? Welcome to episode 7. Today's episode is all about true crime. This is a topic that I am absolutely fascinated with, and anytime anybody wants to talk true crime, I'm game. I'm absolutely down. But over the years, I've noticed I've consumed a lot of true crime content, podcasts and documentaries over the year. I'm like first subscriber for Discovery Plus, so I can get more. But there have been a lot of patterns that I've noticed emerge over the years that I've been watching, and that's kind of where we're going for today's discussion. But our journey will first start with a little bit of background information and some historical context, and then we'll get into some of those observations that I mentioned a second ago. All right? I don't know what you're drinking, but I told you I'm back on whiskey. I told you I would be. This is a whiskey and orange, and if you stick around for how I'm vibing, I'll tell you what's in it. All right. As I mentioned, my favorite genre of podcasts, and maybe storytelling generally, is true crime. I am fascinated by the human capacity for violence. I am fascinated by how far people will go and do really brutal, really gruesome things, and how low the bar is for people to do those things. So some of the podcasts that I listen to on a regular basis, my favorite is Crime Junkie. Shout out to Ashley and Britt. Really great show. They have a weekly show, and they do have a few extra merch and a few extra episodes that they put on their Patreon, their paid account monthly. Like I mentioned, I'm all the way in, so I'm on my low tier of Patreon. I pay like the little $5 a month and get an extra episode every month, but it works. So I can never get enough of these stories. They're absolutely fascinating to me. It is what it is. The true crime community really regards the writer Truman Capote's work in Cold Blood as really sort of the origin and the foundation of the genre of true crime. There's an earlier story, the story of the death of the Black Dahlia, or the story of the Black Dahlia, really. And this is a murder that occurs back in about like 1947, but the story about that isn't written for several decades after that, and the person who writes it is actually quite interesting in and of itself. The relationship there is interesting in and of itself. I became more acquainted with the story of the Black Dahlia and all of its really creepy and wild tentacles through a podcast called Root of Evil. When I listened to Root of Evil, I think maybe last summer, any opportunity I had to talk about it, I was talking about it, because I'd never listened to no shit like that before. I'd never heard a story like that before. There's, violence is one thing, but all of the other mess of human relations that's in that one is it's in my top tier of things that are podcasts that are just like, wow, y'all wildin'. So yeah, Root of Evil is one that I loved. Crime Junkie is my favorite, which I listen to probably weekly, and even go back and listen to some of the archived episodes. Southern Fried True Crime is another. Park Predators Counterclock, I believe, is in its 3rd season, and they've had some interesting stories that they've told over those 3 seasons. In the Dark, the story of Curtis Flowers, that's referenced in the 1st season. I believe it's the 1st season of In the Dark. I'll come back to that. I have some points about that, some things that I learned actually as a political science professor from that episode. Up and Vanished, the story of Tara Grinstead, or at least the 1st season, is about a missing beauty pageant queen and high school teacher, woman named Tara Grinstead, who's from I can't remember the city now, but she's from Georgia. And that one is hosted by Payne Lindsay, he does Up and Vanished, and then he also did Atlanta Monster, the story about Wayne Williams, the famed child murderer from Atlanta, who was ultimately convicted of the child murders in Atlanta. One that I don't actually rock with is My Favorite Murder, which it's so weird because My Favorite Murder is it's like usually top of true crime podcasts in almost every ranking that you'll see. Just crazy to me because those two, they banter on for about 30 minutes, sometimes about 45 minutes, and then you get to the story, and that just doesn't work for me. Like, let's get to it. I want the story. I want the gruesome brutality as quickly as we can get to it. And that one just doesn't do it for me. But nonetheless, it's definitely one of the well-knowns, a very well-known podcast. In the true crime community, the Alabama writer Truman Capote is really credited as being kind of the grandfather of this genre of storytelling. Believe it or not, he and the other great author, Alabama being my home state, I just wanted to say that. But his bestie is Harper Lee, who wrote the classic To Kill a Mockingbird. The two of them decided to take a road trip to Kansas to investigate this story that Capote had discovered probably somewhere around 1959, 1960. And what had happened was there was essentially a mass murder of a family in a rural farm town in Kansas. And the family this was a rural part of Holcomb, Kansas. In 1959, the family was the Clutters. It was four of them that were killed in 1959. And so around 59, 60, Capote and Harper Lee head off to Kansas to interview residents of this town, to interview the people who did the investigations, to find out more about what happened here. About 6 weeks after the murders, the two men who committed the murders were caught and then convicted, and ultimately they were executed by the state of Kansas. As it turns out, to this day, Truman Capote's book, which was published in 1966, so it took him a full 6 years to do all of the research and to put his work together. But to this day, that book is the second highest selling work of the genre. The one that takes the top is Vincent Bugliosi's book Helter Skelter, which is about the Manson family murders, which is written in the 1970s. So it's, here you have something that from the late 1960s that stood the test of time in these stories. And I mean, I know that the true crime community is in fact a community with deep, deep roots. So it doesn't surprise me at all that story, when it happened all those years ago, and the fact that it's four people and that it's a full family that's murdered is certainly one that's going to cause people to remember it, and it's going to cause people to want to know what the hell happened, right? For what it's worth, also, In Cold Blood is a part of the biopic that Philip Seymour Hoffman, the great late Philip Seymour Hoffman, won the Oscar for back in 2006. Really gives an amazing performance in the role, and the movie is actually a really, really, really good one. So if you don't get a chance to listen to any podcasts or read the books about it, definitely go back and check out the biopic. It's really fantastic, and Philip Seymour Hoffman, without question, deserved the Academy Award for that performance. What I'm realizing, as more true crime podcasts and more true crime stories really kind of come to the forefront, there are a lot of patterns that pop up. There are a lot of commonalities that occur across those stories. And so what I've thought about over the years, I've seen them, but they really kind of started to coalesce into some real significant points for me over this last year. But I think that true crime really exposes the biases and the weaknesses that are attached to policing and criminal justice. And I feel like I should just say this. I am not an abolitionist. I am fully in favor of reimagining what policing means in our communities and what justice means, what incarceration means. I'm fully on board with reimagining what those things mean. I am not necessarily on board with abolishing a punishment system. I probably will take some daggers for that, but that's okay. I don't mind. I maintain there are some people that you cannot live peacefully among, and however it is that we fix that, I'm okay with it. But I maintain there are some people that we cannot live peacefully among before they get that help. So I wanted to mention in reference to that, there's a really great quote. I think it's a great quote that comes from Tarantino's The Hateful Eight. And the quote comes from the hangman, John Ruth. And he says, "You only need to hang mean bastards, but mean bastards you need to hang. Some people are mean bastards." Nonetheless, that part about true crime exposing biases and weaknesses in policing and criminal justice is one. The ineptitude in investigations is two. A pathology about, there exists a kind of pathology about Black and brown communities that we just sort of accept. And when I say we, I mean we in terms of a broader kind of global community, not me, and maybe not you, but there is a pathology that we sort of accept about Black and brown communities. Oh, they are more violent. Or they are more prone to criminality. They are less moral. Their moral fabric is, not as strong as other folks. And these are stories that have been kind of told about certain communities for, as long as we've known stories to be told. I'm here to tell you that true crime suggests that is not true. Even if you didn't know, even if you didn't in your heart and soul question that kind of bias. If you follow true crime, then you know that these things can't possibly be true. And so I'll reference where some of these points are coming from as we go through this conversation. Also, so at the same time I'm talking about, pathology for certain communities, there's also a much quicker rush to give over compassion and sympathy for cases that include white folks. I mean, I just have to say it like that. One of the ones that I've been watching, or a documentary, a true crime documentary that I watched over the weekend, was started with a missing young woman case in Alabama, and it turned into a story of incest and trafficking, all things that are happening in a small South Alabama town, among a community of folks who know each other, and among a family within a family. And it was fascinating to me how we kind of built up. So it's just about I want to say it's about a 5 or 6 part documentary series. And for probably the first 3 episodes or so, they're building the case. They're giving us the foundation, letting us know what the story is and, what this world is that we're entering into. And then once we find out just how dark the world that we're entering in is, almost immediately there is sympathy for what these folks have gone through. There's sympathy for, folks don't know any better, and so they're victims too. And I found that fascinating. I found the ability for folks in the video and for producers and the other folks that were interviewed or gave comments for the documentary, the speed at which they went from "this is awful" to "the perpetrators are victims too." I don't see that happening in communities that look like communities that are full of people who look like me or who are brown like me. And so that's another observation. I don't know what number that was, but I hope you are keeping tabs. Next up is bias against girls and women. And this one cuts across. So there are levels to this. So you got bias against girls and women generally. Police officers, law enforcement can certainly, if it's a small town for sure, and you hear something bad that some guy is doing, if that guy is powerful within a town, or if that guy is like homies with people who are on the police force, then there's more of a chance that that guy gets to live in that community untouched for longer. I'm not saying he won't get caught. I'm not saying that the officers won't ever investigate. They will. But it may take them longer, and the investigation may not be as stringent if it was somebody who was a stranger. If it was a woman, for example, that the community perceives to be of high character or of high value. If you're dealing with a woman who may be poor, a woman who may be black, brown, a woman who is a sex worker, a woman who has a history of drug abuse, a woman who has a history or who has a reputation for being sexually liberated. Women who fall in those categories are women who do not get valued the same way by law enforcement. Crime Junkie actually does a pretty good job, and I don't know if other ones do. I've listened to Crime Junkie for a very long time now, and so I've noticed a pattern in the way that they work. They're intentional about telling the stories of women in particular, women of color, and of people who are from gender identities or sexual identities that are often marginalized. They're very intentional about telling those stories because they know, as members of the true crime community, as crime junkies, they know that those stories are ones that don't always rise to the top and get sort of top billing on keeping the public informed about what's happening. And so that bias that exists in law enforcement for the types of victims is also an interesting case. You see over and over and over again, whenever there's a young woman or a young girl who goes missing, something befalls her, parents are very reluctant to reference times in that young woman's past that might have been rocky. And if the young woman had ever been perceived as a runaway, or if she'd ever run away, it's a wrap. It's a wrap. Like it's going to take longer. If you get law enforcement to care in the same way, it's going to take longer for you to get there. It's going to take longer for law enforcement to get there. And so there's that precious time that's lost by law enforcement essentially saying, oh, well, she's a runaway. And so if she's a runaway, it might just be that she's run away. Maybe she'll come back. Meanwhile, she may very well be a runaway. That doesn't mean that this is a great situation. Doesn't mean that, the case shouldn't be investigated, the story shouldn't be investigated. But you see those patterns emerge very, very often. Monster in the Shadows is the true crime documentary about the family and the girl in Alabama that I was watching over the weekend. It's crazy. Let me talk. I should just go ahead and go there, and let's talk a little more specifically about these biases that exist, or the biases and weaknesses that exist when it comes to the ways that women are perceived. So there's a series on Netflix. It was on Netflix. It's called The Fall. I love stuff about terrible murders and serial killers. As I'm talking through this episode, I'm like, am I okay? It stars Jamie Dornan, I believe, the dude who's in 50 Shades of Grey and all the 50 Shades films, and Gillian Anderson, my girl from X-Files. She says something. So there's The Fall is about these women who go missing and are found murdered. They're, all successful women. They all bear similarities to each other. Dark hair, successful. The killer clearly has a type. Gillian Anderson is a detective who comes from another area. I believe she comes from London to like Belfast to help the local department there investigate these crimes. And there's a point where her boss, who's like the, chief of detectives, I don't know, whatever. But that guy is saying something like, at one point he says, these are innocent women, and these innocent women have been harmed. And Gillian Anderson, who plays a character named Stella, she makes a really great point to rebut him. And she says, can we not do that? Can we not divide women? She said, we've divided women into angels and virgins, vandals and vamps, something like that. Like that, the last part of it is a nice little razzle dazzle. But we've divided women into these innocent, not innocent, virgin, angel, like good, bad, oppositional identities for so long that it doesn't serve anybody. Because, what if this bar that we put up about what makes a woman innocent, she could have, not committed any kind of crime, but her crime is being promiscuous, or her crime is being mouthy, her crime is being assertive. And depending on who it is that is telling the story, who it is that is managing the protection or managing the investigation of a particular kind of case, if that person perceives an individual as not innocent, then maybe the interest or the effort in pursuing that case just isn't as sharp. It isn't as acute. And so she makes that point of saying, you have a victim here. You have a person who was dead, who is the victim of a crime. She didn't stab herself. Somebody else did this to her. And that's the only way that we should be pursuing justice or pursuing this case, not in determining who is innocent and who is innocent and who is not, because the bar is very, very low and the bar is arbitrary. What I find innocent, because you have certain feelings about what it is that women do or what it is that women should do, you may not find that innocent. So let's not use that term at all. It's great to see in a film or great to see on a television show. And it's great to hear a character kind of reference that and make note of it. People don't do that in law enforcement. Or it doesn't seem like folks do that in the law enforcement community.Ose biases absolutely are allowed to stand. So there are a couple of cases. Crime Junkie did an episode on a case about a woman named Alice Crimmins. And this is a case from like the 1960s, I believe. Crimmins is a woman who lives alone. She's married, but she has her marriage is one that's super strained. She has 2 kids. So she wakes up like one night, and finds that her little boy and her little girl are missing from her home. Turns out, as all of these true crime cases do, shout out to Crime Junkie again, because they always say it's never a mannequin. So if ever you're out and you're, it looked like a mannequin, it's not. So don't investigate unless you're ready for that. But Crimmins wakes up to find that her kids are missing. And like I said, like all of these true crime cases ultimately do, the kids are found dead some days later. Because Alice I mentioned that she and her husband have a strained relationship, and she basically does whatever she wants to do. Like, she accepts dates from other men. She dresses in a way that's provocative for the time. And by that, I mean she's in like tight clothes. She's not a frumpy sort of grieving mother. She's grieving, but grieving in her own way. And so remember how I mentioned a second ago about innocence? Because of the way that she lived her life completely external to what happened to her kids, and the way that she dressed and the way that she showed up to certain events, or whenever the cops needed to question her, whenever there was like something that she had to do at like a police station or whatever it was, whenever she showed up to those places, the way she showed up was what the cops understood as not being innocent. The way she presented herself, it wasn't as someone who was deeply grieving loss. It wasn't as someone who looked the part, deemed by them as someone who was grieving loss. And so this woman became their prime suspect, despite the fact that they didn't have evidence, that was consistent with what people were saying about her and what they believed about her and what her husband was sort of saying about her. She became the prime suspect. And the woman, I think she might have been tried like twice. Ultimately, she ended up, I think she's still alive to this day, and she's had to kind of basically fall off the grid and go somewhere else and try to live a peaceful life. Because no matter what happened, the way that she showed up to court, the way she showed up in the process of grieving her children was not perceived as sincere or authentic enough, despite there not being evidence to the contrary. I want to be clear about that. You can definitely have someone who is a Dr. Jekyll and Mrs. Hyde. You know what I'm saying? She absolutely committed these murders and has shown up to be somebody completely different. That happens. Let me be clear about that. I'm not giving sympathy where it's not due here. But in this case, that wasn't the case. What really was driving the investigation and what was really driving the persecution of this woman is that she didn't show up as innocent. She didn't show up the way that people expected her to. So this is a white woman. This is a white woman in like the 50s and 60s who, just was not a good enough victim. And she suffered as a result of that. The next two people I'm gonna talk about from the perspective of the killer themselves. So there's Anthony Sowell, who is regarded as the Cleveland Strangler, I believe. And then Lonnie David Franklin Jr., who is called the Grim Reaper, Southern California. Sowell, this story is more recent, because I believe he was captured within the last 10 years, maybe. In the last 10, 15 years. Just like Lonnie Franklin, these are people who preyed on a particular community because to some degree they knew no one cared. And so in this case, I'm not just talking about, yes, it is a black community, an urban black community. And so there's that part. And then the women who they preyed upon were women who were sex workers or women who were drug abusers. And like I mentioned before, so here's that bias against certain kinds of women who are perceived as innocent, that keeps the investigation into murders that are running rampant in these communities. It keeps those investigations from happening altogether. In the Grim Sleeper case, this is the one in Southern California, Lonnie David Franklin Jr. These murders happen over the course of a couple decades. Like, he starts this in, I want to say, like the 1970s. He doesn't get caught until, I believe it's the 2000s, somewhere in the 2000s. And if you ever watch the documentary, you have, in the first few minutes of it, there are two guys who are interviewed, and they're talking about Lonnie, and they're just talking about how great a guy he is. When the cops came to arrest Lonnie, we were like, ain't no way. This is the brother who worked on cars. He was our friend. He was a good guy, right? So this is how his friends talk about him. Meanwhile, this is the same dude who is picking up women in the street and killing them, sexually assaulting them, and then killing them in his van. And we know that, but they don't know that, and they don't believe it when they hear the cops say this about their friend. What's interesting about that is later on in the documentary, one of these friends talks about having experiences where he objectifies women in the exact same way that Lonnie does. He's never harmed anyone, never murdered anyone. So let's draw that line there. But it's almost like these guys are thick as thieves. Of course you don't recognize the toxicity that exists in your friend, because some of that toxicity exists in you too. And so again, when I mentioned the human capacity for violence that exists, it's also fascinating how the extent to which friends and family just won't believe what is before their eyes, you know, or will protect a predator in a family or a predator in a community because they love them, or because they have a different relationship with that individual and they don't know that part of that individual. I find human beings to be just the most interesting creatures in the kinds of decisions that we make. Before I go on to another example of these biases and weaknesses, I meant to mention earlier that some of my beliefs about human nature also come from the Western political philosopher Thomas Hobbes. I don't fall down where he does in terms of how it is that society should be governed. I don't fall into I'm not a full proponent of where he was on it, but I have thought a lot about it in terms of human nature. So Hobbes is one of the grandfathers of Western European political philosophy. Essentially, the argument that he makes about human nature, about humankind, is that human beings are naturally warring in their natural environment. They will find conflict. They may work together. They may have a cooperative relationship together, but what's more likely is one that's competitive and one where human beings will be harmful to each other. And so to abate this harmfulness, what you need is a very strong leader. And so, leaders who rule by fear or force, obviously they don't necessarily have to be kind, but what they're giving individuals within a society is a sense of security. So even if you're terrified of who your rulers are, the most prescient concern is safety. It is your security. And you cannot be safe, you cannot be secure among people in your community without a very, very strong ruler. Otherwise, the strong will take advantage of the weak. The strong will exploit the weak. The strong will harm the weak. And you need a force, perhaps an authoritarian force that is stronger. I don't know that I agree with all of that. I know that I don't agree with this point about needing an authoritarian force to be stronger. But I do agree with the point about human beings not necessarily being benevolent in their natural environment. And this, for me, is, I think, why I am drawn to true crime, because you get to see that actually play out, and it's not like, at the same time, it's not like, you don't see compassion and things like that play out as well. But this is different. You might say that, oh, well, in order for a conflict to arise, you need something big. There needs to be some significant harm done. And that's the reason this conflict has emerged. Nah, it don't have to be that at all. The bar is low. Bar is very, very low. It could be $10. It could be a bag of weed. It could be because somebody looked at me funny. It could be a mistake. People, it could be because you're joking. You wanted to scare somebody. You actually didn't want to harm somebody, but you went to their door and shot through the door. You shot a 12-gauge shotgun through the door. You shot an automatic weapon. You sprayed a house with it. Your intention wasn't to, according to you, your intention wasn't to hurt anybody. You just wanted to scare them. You killed everybody in the house, man. That's what I mean. The bar is low. And so when you're dealing with true crime and when you're dealing with human capacity for violence, the repercussions of that they're sprawling and they are enormous in ways that kindness and benevolence aren't. I believe that kindness begets kindness. Violence can also beget violence. violence can also create an environment that just quickly becomes unsafe or untrusting, or so many other toxic things. So I wanted to make sure I got that point in about Thomas Hobbes. Let me talk a little bit more about ineptitude in investigations a little bit. There's so many true crime stories like Ashley and Britt are so good for outrage. When you're listening to a story and they might say, did the medical examiner order, or did the prosecutor order these reports from the medical examiner? Did the forensic pathologist or whoever, did they test the DNA? And sometimes the answer to those things is no, right? Which in and of itself, you're in a time where you can test and you can come up with some sort of answers. Sometimes the answer to that question is no, or you may have, they tested it, but they tested it like 2 years later. Or the evidence that might have been directly related to this case somehow went missing. It was in the whatever the evidence storage lockup, whatever it is, it was there. And then when it was time for it to be used to exonerate someone or to inculpate someone, to prove someone actually did a thing, somehow it's missing. And there are no answers. So maybe the evidence was supposed to be shipped off to some other place so that it could be tested, and the company or the lab or whatever it is waiting to receive the items, and they never get there. So where's the evidence? What happened to it? Nobody knows. And so now that however important that piece of evidence was to a particular case, it's gone. Nobody knows. Nobody's going to try to find it. Nobody's going to recoup it. And so, whatever that meant to the story, or whatever that meant to the case, or the guilt or innocence of an individual, or the justice that people are seeking, you got to try again. You got to try something different. In many cases, the ineptitude is linked to those biases that I mentioned before. The fact that police may wait or may be just sort of lackadaisical in terms of investigating a missing persons case, if it's a young woman, who's been a runaway, or if it's a young woman who has a history of drug abuse or history of sex work. This is certainly not to say that all of them will behave the same way, but the speed at which they get themselves involved, the effort that they're willing to give for a particular victim or someone who's perceived to be a victim, depending on their biases for that individual, for those folks from whatever communities they're from, can certainly, result in ineptitude in investigations. These are, I recognize too that, I'm looking at true crime cases. So I'm always looking at, or very often looking at situations where everything went wrong. You may have a victory in that the perpetrator, the assailant, was caught and jailed or executed or whatever. You may see that as a victory, but a part of true crime is that there's there are whole genres where everything that happened is a mystery. Where this person is a mystery. What happened to them is a mystery. And there are, years and years and years where the case is unsolved. The murder is unsolved. Nobody has any justice related to it. So it's I want to give some room for the fact that investigations are difficult. I want to give over some grace to law enforcement for that point. At the same time, sometimes y'all be wilding too. You see information in front of you, or you see a community that you don't value in the same way, and so the justice that folks seek, or the answers that people seek in a particular case, just they get lost. All right, I talked about ineptitude, pathology, bias. I wanted to reference a couple cases with a little bit more specificity. Not completely, because I kind of want you to listen to some of these podcasts, because I want you to go on the journey that I went on. Let me talk a little bit about Root of Evil and Monster in the Shadows. Yeah, I'll talk about those two because they're somewhat similar. Root of Evil is a podcast that starts out talking about the death of the Black Dahlia. And let me tell you what her real name was. This was a real woman. Elizabeth Short was her name. Born July 29th, 1924, died January 15th, 1947, and died in a really, really gruesome way. It's really quite a story. The podcast, the way that I came to the podcast was there's a TV show starring Chris Pine about it. It was like a special series called I Am the Night. A young woman had been living in a part of, I believe it's a part of Southern California. She was a very, very light-skinned woman, and she's living in a black neighborhood with a black woman with a black mother. But she goes through all kinds of troubles because this is, segregated time, and the fact that she's very, very light-skinned and she's living among all these black people. And so there's, you got all of these issues that are associated there. The young woman ultimately finds she lives with a mother who is kind of an alcoholic, and she's somewhat abusive. They have it's a very strained relationship. The mother loves her, but the mother is, you can tell something ain't right here. There are lots of things that are wrong here. And so the young woman basically goes looking for answers to her life. And she finds a birth certificate and connects basically that the information that she sees on her birth certificate is different from the information that her mother has given her. And so she questions her mother about it, and ultimately that leads her to the Hodel family. The connection between this and the Black Dahlia is that it has been long suspected that the father, Hodel, might have been the person who murdered the Black Dahlia. And the reason that that's suspected, as you go deeper into the family story, so as I said, this young woman found this family completely by mistake. And when she found them, it turned out that there's all kinds of mess associated with this family. Hodel might have been both her father and her grandfather, and that may have been the reason that she was given away in the first place. She was never expected to find this family again, and never expected to hear these stories again, but she did. The woman who the I Am the Night story is about, it's her daughters that are the ones who are telling the stories on the podcast. And so this is not, this isn't people who are removed from the family. These are people who are in the family who've now contacted each other, who've now started to share stories about what their experiences were. You think you're talking about a case of mistaken identity, or a case of like maybe snatched at birth or something like that. And so you thinking that this is where this true crime story is going, but it turns into one that's much darker and much deeper. The father, I want to remember his name now. Hold on. Let me give you his name. George Hodel. That was his name. So George Hodel was a physician, and this is kind of the patriarch of this family. And this is the person who I mentioned a second ago is the young woman who the television series is about. George Hodel may be both her father and her grandfather, and she doesn't know that until she reaches out to them. And over the course of the investigations over the course of her finding out more about her family and talking to more members of the family, one of the sons, I believe this is one of George's sons, one of his younger sons. He's an older man now, but he was a police officer with LAPD at one point. He ultimately wrote a story some years later. I believe this is in like the 1990s maybe, or the 2000s. basically wrote a book suggesting that George Hodel, his family member, the patriarch of his family, probably was the murderer of the Black Dahlia. But that's not even... There are no spoilers. That's not even the point of the podcast. It's worth it to hear just what this young woman finds out, and to hear how she just had no concept of all the things that her family had been involved in. Yeah, just it went from 0 to 60 so fast. Similarly, the Monster in the Shadows documentary that I watched over the weekend, you start with a missing girl in late 2000s, early 2010s. The girl was last seen with her uncle. Once the girl is reported missing, the police are like, "Hey, uncle, we want to talk to you." But the uncle decides that he's not going, and he attempts to take his life. His wife, instead of calling the police immediately or calling 911 immediately to get some help for her husband, she deletes text messages. The deletion of those text messages raise questions about, where's this girl? Where's the young woman who went off with her uncle? And why, when we want to ask the uncle questions, did he kill himself or attempt to kill himself? And why, when he attempted to kill himself, did his wife not immediately call 911 to get him help, but instead delete the text messages? And so this story sprawls out into what becomes a incestuous trafficking ring for family members and children in this part of South Alabama. I bring this one up because I mentioned a few minutes ago about the pathology that's very often attached to Black and brown communities. There are so many people who run through small white communities, small suburban, small rural white communities that inflict a serious amount of harm. There are women who go missing, men and women who go missing every year, who come up brutally harmed every year, and in many cases, 5, 6, 7, 8 that come from a particular community, and there is no widespread story about something that's happening in this community. And so I'm not asking for, I'm not asking for pathology to not be called out when it is in fact pathology. I'm more fascinated by the narratives. I mean, they just become so much more obvious when you see this in true crime. You see how the narratives that are created about certain communities, that same kind of thing just doesn't happen in others. True crime exposes this in a really significant and very obvious way. And let me talk about Curtis Flowers real quick. Curtis Flowers is the case against Curtis Flowers is the one that's chronicled in, I believe, season 1 of In the Dark. This brother he's just been released within the last year and a half, officially released without any strings attached. This brother was convicted or was tried 6 times for murdering 4 people in a furniture store in Mississippi. He was tried 6 times because for whatever reason, each of the previous convictions were not upheld. And the district attorney or the prosecutor in that case kept bringing the case back, kept bringing the charges back. There's something to be said here about the racial dynamics that exist in Mississippi. I mean, you can't ignore those. The fact that it's a Black man who is accused of murdering 4 white people in this part of Mississippi. The fact that the prosecutor does not get clean convictions and keeps bringing the case 6 times. And then you have the Bill of Rights that is meant to protect your civil liberties. except when you have people in powerful positions who understand well how to manipulate and navigate those systems. And so in the case of Curtis Flowers, what the prosecutor often did, and what prosecutors do when they're prosecutors or attorneys, this can happen on either side. In this case, it was a prosecutor, but he's looking at the prospective jurors, any jurors that he thinks are going to be sympathetic to his client are jurors that he's going to strike from the record. And so despite the fact that you hear about this Fifth Amendment to a speedy trial, to have a trial by a jury, to have a jury of your peers, and those of you who still think of the criminal justice system as being one that's unbiased and one that has justice, fair justice as its pursuit, this is where you see in places like jury selection, is where you see that perceived lack of bias begin to crumble. Because like I said before, if an attorney is looking for a juror or an attorney is looking to strike, prosecutor looking to strike a juror that may be sympathetic to the defendant, those terms, sympathetic, how you define that, for some folks, if you got a black guy and you got a black woman on the jury, you might be thinking that, well, it's a black woman. Black women are going to be sympathetic to this black man. And so black women, as many black women as possible, we need to make sure that they don't end up on this jury. We're not calling that racial discrimination in the jury selection process. You're calling that kind of a prudent decision about who to determine is going to be a juror, but this racial discrimination in the jury selection process. That's exactly what it is. And so that bias infects a case from early on. It infects a case almost at every level. You got, bias in terms of sexual orientation, bias in terms of gender, bias in terms of race, in terms of class. All of those things impact the criminal justice system at every single level. From before you even interact with the criminal justice system in terms of what your community is like, the environment, is criminality more likely to occur in your particular community because of, certain factors? And I'm not talking about race, I'm talking about economics and development. The role that societal factors play in that part become just as apparent and just as impactful at every other stage of the game. From your interactions with people within your community, your interactions with police, and then your interactions with the broader law enforcement community. And then if you happen to be imprisoned or convicted, there's a whole other series of things that are coming. But each of these things, I think, is really revealed in a significant way if you're following true crime. It's very, very hard to miss it. It's hard to not see those things. So if there are any other stories I want to tell you, I'll let it go. And so what I'll do instead is I'll link out to, in the show notes, I'll link out to a couple of the podcasts that I've been listening to, and maybe even some of the most interesting episodes that I've seen. So check the show notes for that. And before I let y'all go, let me tell you how I'm vibing this week. I said I'm having a whiskey and orange, and what's in this is Maker's 46, a muddled orange wedge, and Grand Marnier. Now, yes, you can use orange juice, but it's not the same. The value that you get from the oils and the peel, all of that matters in this cocktail. I also put a little bit of bitters in there too. All of this matters in this cocktail. It's a pretty whiskey forward cocktail too. So if you're not in the mood for that, then be mindful. All right. So that's what I'm drinking. What am I watching? What am I listening to this week? Spent some time with Aaliyah's 1 in a Million. I love that album. I love 1 in a Million. I'm ready for the Red album. I have had It's Whatever on repeat for like the last 2 weeks. Don't send me down the rabbit hole of It's Whatever, but I'm waiting for that album. I remember that one from right when I was getting ready to graduate. I wasn't getting ready to graduate college. I think this was like my junior year of college, and final year of her life. So I'll never forget that. I'll never forget the Rock the Boat video. Never forget everything that happened and how the news of Aaliyah's tragic end spread through my apartment complex at Tuskegee University. My best friend and I lived together in East Commons, and I think I heard it first and like ran out and was like, yo, this is what they're saying about Aaliyah, and it turned into a whole thing that we were consumed with for the next several days. I do love that those of us who are around that time to like enjoy that music did not let it die, and it would have been easy to not hear Aaliyah's music for 20 years and to just be like, oh, that was, the music of my youth, and to let it go. But I think there's something really, really cool about the fact that we wanted that. We loved it, and wanted more of her. And so I'm happy that we're getting more of her albums. We're getting better and easier access to her music. So that's exciting to me. I think that's it. I haven't been, there isn't anything in particular that I'm binging and watching that I want to mention to you outside of the true crime documentaries and all of that stuff. Maybe something cooler will come up next time. But thank y'all for listening. Remember to follow Pop Politics Pod on Instagram, and you can also subscribe to the YouTube feed. So obviously I'm doing video now, and those will be up very, very soon. So make sure to stay in the loop. Go ahead and click the notification bell. I'm hearing Judge Lake from Paternity Court in my head. But yeah, subscribe to the podcast. You can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, subscribe on Spotify, and follow the podcast on Instagram. Cool. All right. Thank you. I'll see y'all next time.